Stop what you're doing for a second because something hit the tape less than an hour ago, and it is already rippling through markets in a way most people won't notice until it is too late. This is not a rumor from social media, and it is not a vague headline. It reads a sequence of numbers that, if you understand them, can change how you look at cash, bonds, and so-called safe assets. Quick favor before we go deeper. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because stories like this can move faster than the news cycle, and you donatee want the key update to pass you by. Here's the claim that's spreading right now. At 1:23 p.m. Eastern, a large liquidity operation was executed and labeled routine. But when you zoom in on the structure, it doesn't behave like routine stabilization. It resembles a setup that forces constant refinancing. And that matters because once the system becomes dependent on frequent rollovers, the next step is often bigger, faster, and harder to stop. According to transaction prints and operation logs circulating among traders, the purchase size was around $47.3 billion in Treasury securities, and the headline number is not the most important detail here. The maturity is what changes the implications, because this was reportedly focused on ultra-short bills rather than longer-dated bonds or notes, and short maturities turn policy actions into countdown clocks instead of long-term support. A 28-day bill is not something you can ignore for a quarter and revisit later because it matures quickly and forces the issuer to refinance almost immediately. In normal conditions, that can be harmless, but in stressed conditions, the market can struggle to absorb supply without yields, jumping dealers hitting balance sheet limits or auctions getting shaky, and that's when routine interventions start repeating to avoid exposing what's underneath. So the mechanics are simple. If a central bank creates reserves to buy short-dated government paper, the issuer gets funded today, but 4 weeks later, the paper comes due and the issuer has to come up with the money again. If the easiest path is issuing more bills, and if demand isn't strong enough, then the backstop gets used again. Issue, refinance, repeat. And that repetition is why people start using phrases like debt spiral, not as a slogan, but as a math problem. Now here, as where the story gets explosive online, roughly 20 to 30 minutes after that 123 print, unusual buy pressure reportedly hit precious metals markets across several major venues in a tight window, with traders describing similar timing, similar sizing, and flow that looked coordinated rather than random. To be clear, correlation is not proof, and markets can move for many reasons. But when multiple venues move in the same direction with the same urgency, professionals treat it as a signal worth watching. The numbers being shared are enormous. Multi-billion notional in silver, even more in gold, and a smaller but noticeable push in platinum. And the most controversial claim is who was behind it. The chatter isn't pointing at hedge funds this time. It's pointing at entities believed to be official institutions or state-linked desks using coded identities building exposure shortly after the liquidity event. And if that were true, it would imply someone expected that money creation pressure would show up in currency purchasing power, so they wanted hard asset exposure first. Another layer of the claim is that delivery requests spiked immediately after the buying, meaning some players weren't satisfied with paper exposure and wanted settlement that points toward physical allocation. If you've never looked at metals delivery, the difference is huge. Futures can be rolled or cash settled, but delivery turns the trade into a draw on scarce inventory. And that scarcity is what can change pricing behavior from normal volatility into tightness. And that brings us to the next timestamp everyone is watching. 3:15 p.m. today. Screenshots of an internal schedule are circulating and they're unverified, but they're spreading because they suggest another liquidity action may be queued, possibly larger than the earlier one, and if a second operation happens, the key question is whether the sequence repeats: liquidity action, synchronized metals bid, and then abnormal settlement behavior. A repeated pattern turns a coincidence into a trackable signal, and signals are what serious money trades. Number 1, watch the official operations feed for posted actions and settlement details, not just screenshots. Number 2, watch whether metals buying shows up across multiple venues within minutes in the same direction. Number 3, watch for unusual delivery notices, inventory drawdowns, or spread behavior that suggests real tightening. Now, why would the system lean on short-term actions in the first place? One explanation is basic market plumbing. When large holders sell treasuries quickly, yields can jump, dealers can choke on inventory, and funding can get tight. So a backstop steps in to smooth volatility and avoid disorderly outcomes. There's also the global angle, because reserve managers respond to real returns, currency risk, and geopolitical risk, and when confidence wobbles, diversification accelerates, often into assets that don't rely on another party's promise to pay. So even without a scandal, the structural tension remains. Support the bond market with liquidity, and you risk weakening purchasing power, but defend purchasing power with tighter conditions, and you risk breaking the bond market. which is why every routine operation gets interpreted through a more suspicious lens when the public already feels the rulebook favors insiders. If the 315 action happens and the pattern repeats, the next layer won't be about one trade. It will be about dependency, frequency, and the point where routine becomes the thing holding the entire narrative together. Because the most viral version of this story says, this has been running for months. The allegation is simple. Every time a sizable liquidity action hits, a wave of metals buying appears 20-30 minutes later. They point to past dates, they claim the timing was consistent. And if big players can anticipate liquidity, they can anticipate what tends to move next. When liquidity rises, the expected future purchasing power of cash can soften. Even if rates don't move much, that's because the system is pricing more supply of money into the future. In that environment, assets with constrained supply often get attention. Not because they're magical, because they're hard to create on demand. So if you're fast, you buy the hedge before the crowd understands why the hedge is moving. That's getting ahead of the flow, and it happens in every market. The controversy begins only when the story implies privileged access. Access the public doesn't have. Some posts claim the buyer identities weren't random. They claim the IDs were sequential. They highlight labels that look like CN 2847, RU 2848, SA 2849. They argue the numbering proves pre-planning. Could that be true? Maybe. Or it could be a nothing burger. Clearing firms assign tags in all kinds of patterns. Without primary documentation, it's speculation dressed as certainty. Then comes the loudest claim. A whistleblower released internal communications. The thread says officials allegedly gave advance notice of operations to foreign counterparts. They call it a coordination protocol. They attach screenshots. They attach bold language. Here's what matters. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary confirmation. If a leak is real, reputable outlets corroborate it. Metadata gets examined. Multiple independent sources validate the chain. Until that happens, treat it as unverified, not as a verdict. But don't miss why this resonates even if the leak is fake. Because there's a real structural issue underneath. Rollover dependence. When a government leans hard on short-term bills, it has to refinance constantly. When refinancing costs rise, pressure rises with it. And the system reaches for tools, outright purchases. Markets adapt. Then they test the limits. Then they force the next response. Now decode liquidity operation, because that phrase hides details. A repo is temporary. Cash goes out, collateral comes in. The trade unwinds later. An outright purchase is different. It adds assets to the balance sheet. It changes the footprint. Two actions can look similar on a timeline and behave differently in the plumbing. That's why verification isn't optional. Operation results, settlement details, balance sheet releases. Those are the boring receipts that separate reality from viral fiction. When the official documents don't match the viral numbers, you've learned something important about the narrative. Now, on the metal side, there's another confusion. When people say they bought billions of gold, they often mean notional futures exposure, not truckloads of bars. A single contract controls a lot of metal with a small margin deposit, so the headline number can sound bigger than the immediate cash movement. Physical is different. Physical means logistics, vaulting, insurance, chain of custody. That's why the delivery angle matters if it's real. Delivery turns a trade into a draw on scarce inventory. And scarcity is what changes pricing behavior. Also, inventories aren't one single pile. Venues report categories, often registered versus eligible. Registered usually means deliverable against contracts. Eligible can mean it's in a vault but not committed. A move between categories can be paperwork, or it can be participants choosing to remove deliverable supply. Those interpretations are worlds apart. Now circle back to the 28-day detail everyone keeps repeating. Ultra-short bills are liquid. They're easy to price. They carry little duration risk. In calm markets, they're cash-like. In stressed markets, that short maturity is a flashing indicator. It says, we need refinancing now, not next quarter. Why would policy target the front end? Because funding pressure shows up there first. If dealers can't warehouse supply, the front end creaks. If money market demand wobbles, the front end creaks. Supporting it can be a way to stop stress from rippling outward. And if you're wondering why official institutions might want metals exposure at the same time, there's a non-mystical explanation. Reserves managers care about diversification. They care about liquidity. They care about assets that don't depend on another party's promise to pay. Gold, especially, is a balance sheet asset with no counterparty credit risk. So when uncertainty rises, adding hard assets can be plain risk management. But even plain risk management can stack up into big effects. If enough large actors lean the same way at the same time, inventories tighten. So what do you do with this without panic? Auction results, funding rates, inventory reports, price action across venues. And you remember, your job isn't to predict a doomsday headline, it's to understand the risk map. Number 1, track short-term stress signals, auction demand, funding rates, sudden yield spikes. Number 2, watch for cross-venue synchronization, the same move on multiple exchanges within minutes. Number 3, watch for tangible tightening, wider spreads, delivery notices, or inventory drawdowns. Because synchronization is what changes the story. One exchange can be a local event. Multiple exchanges at once suggests a shared trigger or a shared playbook. Either way, it's information. So yes, keep your eye on 3:15 p.m. Not because a thread told you history changes today, because intraday liquidity actions can reveal stress before headlines admit it. If a second operation prints and the same pattern appears, you'll have something more valuable than a hot take. And just to be clear, this is analysis, not personal financial advice. Your edge isn't panic, it's understanding what's happening in real time before the story gets sanitized, or the story we tell ourselves about how safe the system really is, because the moment the story breaks, everything prices differently, and the next timestamp on the clock might not come with a warning label.